Buon pomeriggio a tutte e a tutti, vedo che già molte persone si stanno collegando, un benvenuto da parte mia e da parte di Mondadori Education. Questo pomeriggio siamo ad un nuovo appuntamento, il terzo e ultimo di questo anno scolastico, con la letteratura inglese e di nuovo con grande piacere con il professore Arturo Cattaneo. Non c'è bisogno di presentazione, sono certa che questa platea lo conosca molto bene, ma velocemente vi ricordo che il professore è ordinario di letteratura inglese presso l'Università Cattolica di Milano, saggista, autore di 2 romanzi e autore delle nostre storie e antologie della letteratura inglese destinate alle scuole superiori. Quest'anno ha pubblicato insieme a noi l'ultima edizione della sua fortunata letteratura Literary Journeys con il sottotitolo Connecting Ideas, che probabilmente molti di voi hanno già avuto modo di conoscere, un testo che analizza e attualizza gli aspetti, quanto più possibile, gli aspetti interdisciplinari, partendo dai grandi temi, dai grandi autori e dalle grandi opere della letteratura inglese. Bene, l'argomento del webinar di questo pomeriggio è Shakespeare in the War of the Cinema Against the Theatre. Un argomento stimolante che si collega ad una recentissima pubblicazione del professor Cattaneo, uscita lo scorso febbraio, nella collana Grandi Saggi di Einaudi. Il titolo è Shakespeare in Hollywood, un saggio nato da una interessante esperienza di insegnamento, con la quale il professor Cattaneo e il suo coautore, regista ed esperto di cinema Gianluca Fumagalli hanno percorso un viaggio lungo un secolo fra cinema e teatro in Europa e in America, al fine di sottolineare come Hollywood, nella sua sfida per ottenere l'egemonia nell'intrattenimento moderno rispetto al teatro, abbia proposto, assimilato, rielaborato sempre le grandi storie, i grandi personaggi shakespeariani. Così facendo, gli autori del saggio ci mostrano come Shakespeare, più di ogni altro autore, di ogni altro scrittore, in maniera particolare nel mondo anglosassone, abbia lasciato al cinema, oltre che al teatro chiaramente, una magnifica eredità, e come centinaia di attori, registi, scrittori abbiano lavorato a film o in film ispirati alle sue opere. Chiedo alla regia se per favore ci fa vedere un attimo la copertina molto evocativa di questo volume. Se possibile, Massimiliano, grazie, eccolo. Un volume che vi consiglio di leggere e di fare leggere ai vostri studenti, se possibile. Vi si trovano moltissimi spunti collegabili non solo alla letteratura inglese, ma anche ad altre letterature europee, alla storia del cinema, alla cultura in generale. Vi troverete, i vostri studenti anche, vi troveranno ottimi spunti anche per sviluppare interessanti percorsi tematici proprio in vista della prova orale della maturità, in cui le interconnessioni sono un aspetto particolarmente sentito e importante. Fra l'altro, appunto, durante l'esposizione, se avete piacere, vi faccio incollare nella chat il link alla presentazione del volume nella pagina di Einaudi, nella pagina del sito web di Einaudi, così potete prenderne i riferimenti. Bene, prima di lasciarvi a questo interessantissimo appuntamento col professore, vi espongo brevemente alcuni necessari aspetti tecnici per lo svolgimento di questo pomeriggio insieme. Allora, innanzitutto voi potete fare domande e inserirle nella chat di YouTube. L'attestato di partecipazione sarà disponibile nei prossimi giorni sul sito Mondadori Education, alla pagina attestati, così come le slide che vi troverete le slide che il professore utilizzerà in questa diretta. Per coloro che vedranno invece questo evento in differita, l'attestato sarà disponibile solo ai partecipanti che avranno effettuato l'accesso dalla mail di conferma oggi entro la mezzanotte, entro le 23:59 di oggi. La registrazione video resterà invece disponibile sul nostro canale YouTube allo stesso indirizzo al quale lo state vedendo in questo momento. Se poi desiderate essere informati circa la programmazione delle nostre dirette, iscrivetevi al nostro canale YouTube premendo il tasto iscriviti che trovate in basso e poi sulla campanella che vi comparirà al fianco. Quindi fate pure le vostre domande in questa chat, io le leggerò e al termine presentazione del professore gliele porgerò da parte vostra e il professore, appunto, compatibilmente con i tempi, vi risponderà. Benissimo, mi sembra di avere richiamato tutte le istruzioni necessarie, quindi lascio la parola al professor Cattaneo, che saluto e ringrazio per la sua presenza. Professore, a lei.
Grazie Milvia, buongiorno a tutti e a tutte, sono io che ringrazio ancora una volta la Mondadori e i presenti, anche perché l'argomento di oggi, faccio una brevissima premessa, mi è particolarmente gradito, non tanto perché sia un mio libro, ma perché, come accennava Milvia, questo libro è nato da un lavoro con gli studenti svolto in classe per parecchi anni con l'amico regista Gianluca Fumagalli. E cioè un po' di tempo fa mi sono reso conto che i nostri studenti hanno maggiore familiarità, cosa ovvia se vogliamo, ma da sperimentare in classe, con l'elemento visivo, con la narrazione visiva, con la struttura di un testo visivo che non con un testo scritto, per ragioni generazionali. Ed è stato allora che ho cominciato a usare molto l'elemento visivo nello studio della letteratura e della lingua, come primo accesso appunto alla letteratura, come accesso privilegiato. E da quella è nata tutta una ricerca sul campo appunto con Fumagalli. E comincerei appunto a raccontarvi un po' questa storia, che è diventata poi un libro in classe e ovviamente anche fuori dalla classe con lo studio che abbiamo fatto con Gianluca. So this is the story of Shakespeare in the war of the cinema against the theater, and it's an amazing story. It was a big surprise for us in the first place, for Gianluca and myself, because after a while, after looking at watching film after film and reading book after book, we realized something, that we should not ask what Hollywood had done for Shakespeare, that he is filming his plays, as what Shakespeare had done for Hollywood, so the other way around. And that was teaching Hollywood the art of narration. That's one thing. The extraordinary thing, the first one we found out, was that Shakespeare is the writer who has to his credit more Academy Awards and more nominations for the Academy Awards. A big surprise. This is a short list. It's not complete by any means, but it's quite telling, isn't it? We called it The Oscar Goes to William Shakespeare. And it started quite early in 1933 with Morning Glory, for which Katharine Hepburn got an Oscar for Best Actress. And it goes on through Romeo and Juliet, 1936. Obviously, Henry V, Laurence Olivier, 1946. Hamlet, 1948, again, one of the films on which we'll be laying our attention later on. And then it goes on through the famous Julius Caesar with Marlon Brando as Mark Antony, Richard III, West Side Story, the other film which we'll be dealing with today, and then Taming of the Shrew, Zeffirelli, and Zeffirelli's most famous Romeo and Juliet. And it's amazing to find out, to see how many Oscars have been won by Shakespeare, the most titulated writer in history. Quite strange, but quite surprising. And I've divided my presentation in 3 points. First one is the beginning of the relation between the cinema and Shakespeare plays, which is the beginning of the whole story. The second one goes straight to the point of our talk, the war of the cinema against the theater in the name of Shakespeare, and we'll see what that means. Then I'd like to see with you 2 interdisciplinary case studies. One is Hamlet, 1948, and the other one is West Side Story, a few years later, 1961. So very famous both, quite easily available. Now, it all starts with the beginning, obviously, of the relation between the cinema and Shakespeare's plays, which comes quite early with silent films. A bit strange, isn't it? What has Shakespeare to do with silent films? And we chose this quote from Hamlet, and the rest is silence, to put it visually. But, and that was another surprise, we found out that there were 400, roughly 400 silent films of Shakespeare plays, which is an amazing high number. Of course, one has to consider that most of these films, most of these silent films were very short ones, sometimes a minute, a couple of minutes, 10 minutes, so nothing to do with the long stories, the long films that would come later on. But even so, the number is quite telling. And this is the first Shakespeare film known. It's King John. The interesting thing, it's just 4 shots, in fact. So it's like, 4 images. But it's quite interesting because the player here, the actor here, is Bourbon Tree, the most famous actor of that time. He was named or surnamed, especially in America, the great English actor. Everybody in the world knew him by that name. And the cameraman was William Kennedy Dixon, one of the pioneers of the early cinema. And the interesting thing is that this was a sort of promotion. This short film, very short film, just 4 shots, in fact, was a sort of promotion for the same King John that Bourbon Tree was having at his own theater. So he was having his play, or Shakespeare plays performed at his theater, and at the same time he wanted to experiment with the new medium, the cinema, which shows how even great actors from the very beginning were curious about the film. But of course, the next step comes in 1927 when we have sound films, or what have been were named in America the talkies. Shakespeare then becomes a status symbol for actors and actresses. Why status symbol? Because the moment the cinema could speak, inevitably, it had to confront himself with the theater. Now the cinema could show audiences the same plays written by Shakespeare with the same words, or many of them, if not all of them. In other words, now the cinema could compete with the theater on the same level, on a par. And it was a real tough contest. Why? Because Shakespeare had been played on stage for centuries, whereas actors and actresses in the cinema were not used to speaking. They were used to silent films in which the way one moved and facial gestures and postures were much more important. This is the first film version, and one of the first, if not the first, film taken from Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew, first sound film adaptation. Notice up there, that's a poster. Notice up on top line, all talking, all laughing. Why laughing? It's a comedy, obviously. And it's a particular comedy because Hollywood from the beginning chose one of the genres or subgenres most popular with audiences. Well, in history, the so-called war of the sexes, husband and wife, man and woman fighting, in love, but fighting. And the 2 protagonists were Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, the most famous actors and actresses in the world then. And they were also husband and wife. That was a turbulent relation like Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton some 40 years later. And that increased attention for the film, obviously. The next thing, which shows how Shakespeare was a real status symbol for actors and actresses, is Morning Glory, 1933, with Katharine Hepburn, one of the greatest actresses in history, as we know. She won 4 Oscars, and the first Academy Award she won was for this film, which is not a great film, admittedly. It's the story of a young girl who goes to Broadway to become famous, to become a star. But she finds it difficult to enter the theater world. But one night she's invited to a party, the party we see in the poster here, and she gets drunk. She's not used to that. And while she's drunk, she catches everyone's attention and says, I'm a great actress. I'm the best actress in the world. And I will show you. And she begins to perform, to be or not to be. You see her here dressed in black. After that, she stops and she goes for something completely different. She puts on a white robe, a towel in fact, and she plays Juliet in the balcony scene. Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And this is at the center of that sophisticated comedy called Morning Glory. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the film, but it's so powerful that it won Katharine Hepburn the first of her 4 Oscars. Which goes to show that for actors and actresses, Shakespeare was a trial by fire, literally. You could not qualify to be a great actor or actress if you did not do Shakespeare. That's been true for actors and actresses up to now, even today, and not just in English, but especially in English. If Shakespeare was the trial by fire for players or actors and actresses, it was also instrumental in the war that the cinema was waging against the theater, because that's exactly what it amounted to. And we've seen the results in it in the following decades, and we see them now. For 1,000 people who see a movie, there's one person possibly who sees a play at the theater, which is not to say, obviously, that the cinema is necessarily better than the theater, but there's been a shift in popular audiences. The cinema took over from the theater. And in this war, Shakespeare was instrumental. And again, one of the first films to show that, to be used as a status symbol, was A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1935, directed by Max Reinhardt. Now, Max Reinhardt might ring a bell to many of us. He was a very famous, not just film director, but especially theater director. He did an amazing number of great productions in Europe first and then in America. In Europe, for instance, he did in Venice. He did a wonderful Othello set in Venice, and he did A Midsummer Night's Dream. And before he was asked by Warner Brothers to shoot this film, he had done the same play on stage at the Hollywood Bowl outside Los Angeles, one of the greatest theaters in America. And it was such a success that in a whole week, in just 1 week, 150,000 people went there to see the performance, to see this great show. It was really grandiose. And the important thing for Hollywood was that all the important people were there: politicians, actors, famous people from the sport. Everyone was there. And that was when Jack Warner had the idea: I want that put into a film. I want the same great people who flocked to see Max Reinhardt's Midsummer Night's Dream at the Hollywood Bowl. I want them to sit and watch my film, this one. And the film was a great success. Here we see, one of the famous scenes in the wood. And it was a great success on the night of the opening. We see here crowds waiting for the actors to come. Just as at the night of the Oscars performances. After that, another thing which should be mentioned in the world of the theater, of the cinema against the theater, is Romeo and Juliet. 3 years later, 1936, with two of the greatest stars of the time, Norma Shearer and Leslie Howard. And there was an MGM film, and it's interesting to see what the producer, Ingrid Thalberg, the famous producer of MGM, stated intention was. He said he wanted to make the production what Shakespeare would have wanted had he possessed the facilities of the cinema, which is an interesting point, because by now the cinema was thinking that the cinema, could be more faithful to Shakespeare's intention than the theater was. Of course, that's arguable. But the important thing is that to elevate itself, to won the war against the theater, the cinema needed Shakespeare. And it used Shakespeare again and again. This is the famous balcony scene between, well, I was going to say between the two teenage lovers, but of course they are teenagers in Shakespeare, whereas here they're great actors, they're good looking, but Leslie Howard was 43 and Norma Shearer was 37. It did not matter, or not so much for audiences, because they flocked to see the film, to see the two great stars perform for the first time the word of Shakespeare at the cinema. Some 50%, roughly 45-50% of the word being kept. And by the way, to judge the enormous amount of money that had been put into that film, if we look at the balcony, on the lower part, the bas-relief was taken from one of the pulpits in the cathedral in Siena, because MGM sent a troupe of specialists, of drawers, of painters in Europe, well, in Italy especially, to get paintings and cardboard from the Renaissance, from the real Italian Renaissance, to reproduce them on the screen with anachronistic effects, as in here. But the important thing is that Hollywood put a lot of money into that. They wanted to do something which would outshine the theater. And this, to put the things in historical perspective, this need of Hollywood to outshine the theater goes hand in hand with the American need in the theater to outshine the British, always in the name of Shakespeare. I believe we mentioned in one of our previous webinars last year, maybe, I can't remember now, the famous, or notorious in fact, Astor Place Opera House riot, which took place in New York in the middle of the 19th century. There was a war between two actors, an American one and a British one. And as it said here in this book by Jack Lynch, Becoming Shakespeare, it was much more than a performance style, acting style. It was really about American identity. Because the two actors, William Charles Macready and Edwin Forrest, presented two visions of Shakespeare, one British and aristocratic, the other American and proletarian. And isn't that a bit like the theater, which was still aristocratic when the sound films came out, the talkies came, and the cinema, which is more proletarian, the other American and proletarian. American nationalists were determined to reclaim the great cultural icon as one of their own. He may have been English, there was no denying that, but for these working class Americans, he was above all a democratic playwright, not a supporter of aristocracy. For Americans, he was a self-made man. And that's another reason why, not the least one, why Shakespeare was so important and is still so important for Americans, for America, for Hollywood, for the great cinema. But let's now see in some detail, I hope, a couple of case studies. First one is Hamlet, 1948, which is of course about literature, but it's also about psychology and philosophy, because there's a lot of Shakespeare and Montaigne in that. There's a lot of Freud, and Montaigne in that. The psychoanalytical reading is quite famous of the play, and that's exactly what the director and main actor, the mythical Laurence Olivier, did. Here we see it dressed like Hamlet in the usual dress, not with his usually black hair, but with blonde hair, very blonde hair. Not just because Hamlet was supposed to be Danish, so he might have been blonde, not necessarily, but quite likely, but because that suited much better the black and white film, because Laurence Olivier decided to shoot it in black and white. What did Olivier do? Olivier was, as we know, by that time, one of the three most important players on stage. He was part of a triad that included also Ralph Richardson, and John Gielgud. Laurence Olivier was the third. He was a myth for the theater. But when he directed the film, he had already directed Henry V, some 4 or 7 years before that. So when he turned to Hamlet, Olivier decided to leave out about 50% of the original text. Now, does that sound sacrilegious? Does that sound profane? Well, yes and no. Let's bear in mind that Hamlet is by far the longest play in the Shakespeare canon. That if performed from beginning to end, it would last over 4 years, 4.5, as in Kenneth Branagh's famous Hamlet, integral Hamlet. What does Laurence Olivier do? He leaves out the whole Rosencrantz and Guildenstern story, which is a good part of the story, as we know. He leaves out the second, or he left out the second grave digger in the very beautiful and famous scene at the cemetery, at the graveyard in Act 5, beginning of Act 5. We have in Shakespeare 2 grave diggers who engage in a long conversation, but Laurence Olivier decides to leave out one. He leaves out Fortinbras, that is the political part of the story. He leaves out Reynaldo, Polonius' servant, who has a long exchange with Polonius at the beginning of the play, and even leaves out 2 classes soliloquies. What a piece of work is man, about what a great creature is man, and how all occasions do inform against me, which is one of those soliloquies in which Hamlet despises himself for not being able to act, to revenge his father, his dead father. And by the way, leaving out 2 wonderful soliloquies must have been a real cut for a great prima donna, a great actor like Laurence Olivier. But he did that. Why? Because he wanted to make a film. Another reason why he wanted to, he had to leave out so much, is that having to leave out so much, he decided to concentrate on a particular reading of the play. Of course, the play Hamlet, as we know, is a revenge play, but it's also being read in the 20th century as a psychological play after Freud gave his interpretation of Hamlet according to the Oedipus complex, something which Laurence Olivier knew very well, something which he had done in the theater in the 1930s, so some 10 years before he shot this film. Laurence Olivier had done the same thing on stage with Hamlet, but also with Othello, psychological or psychoanalytical readings of the play. Why? Because of something quite new, maybe, to some of us, I don't know, but quite important. When Shakespeare had the idea of the Oedipus complex, he first had the idea of Hamlet as well. This is a letter of Freud, which it's in Italian because the original obviously is in German, so it would have been no use to translate that. So this is the first letter. This is the first time when Freud realizes that he has something on his hands, the Oedipus complex. Amore per la madre, love for the mother and jealousy for the father. And this is a general phenomenon. And that explains why Oedipus Rex is so catching, why everybody's so taken with that. Because everybody feels within themselves something that they experience, even though unknowingly, without realizing that. Each member of the audience once was an Oedipus in fantasy. And right after that, Freud writes, mi è passata per la mente l'idea che la stessa cosa possa essere alle radici dell'Amleto. That wasn't deliberate on Shakespeare's part, but how can we justify Hamlet's hesitations? How can he explain his hesitation to revenge his father, to kill his uncle, when in other circumstances he is very decided? He sends to death his good friends, university friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He kills Laertes. He kills Polonius, somebody under a curtain, as we know. The explanation for Freud is simple. He feels the Oedipus complex within himself. And 3 years later, that's stated more clearly in Freud's most famous work, The Interpretation of Dreams. The Oedipus Rex is rooted in the same ground as another great creation, tragic creation, Shakespeare's Hamlet. In Hamlet, the childish fantasy, the Oedipus complex, is removed. That's a technical word. And we come to know of its presence, just as in Neurosis, only through the inhibitory effects which follow that. And the play is built on Hamlet's hesitation to revenge his father. So quite clearly, there were grounds, and very strong grounds, for giving such a reading of the play. And, in the Interpretation of Dreams, Freud goes on to expand on that. Ending with the word, last sentence here, Hamlet can do everything except take his revenge on the man who has eliminated his father, killed his father, taking his father's place, next to his mother. The man who shows him the actualization of his childish fantasies, which had been removed. So that was the background. And Laurence Olivier, before putting Hamlet on stage in the 1930s, before putting Othello on stage in the 1930s, and even before shooting this film, went to see Ernest Jones, the famous British-English, in fact, psychiatrist, who had been the first translator of Freud in English, and who wrote a famous Hamlet and Oedipus. So that's a basis. And this particular reading is very interesting for us, obviously, and it leads to interesting interdisciplinary studies. But it also accounts for the fact that given this very narrow, in a way, or let's say fairly narrow reading of the play, Laurence Olivier could take out half of the play, half of the lines. The film is thoroughly, shall we say, Freudian, in a way. It begins with the aerial view of a castle above the roaring sea and enveloped in swirling mist. Then follows on screen a quotation from the play, and the voiceover is a beautiful voiceover by Laurence Olivier, taken from the first act. And it states the background, if you want, of the story, not just the background in terms of action, but the psychological background again, because here Shakespeare says, or Hamlet says, that in some men who are endowed with the greatest gifts, sometimes there is just one thing, one small thing, line 2, some vicious mole of nature. So often it chances in particular men that for some vicious mole of nature, then let's go down, that these men carrying, I say, the stamp of one defect. They're great men, they only have one defect. But that defect takes away, corrupts all their many praises, virtues. Their virtues else shall in the general censure take corruption from that particular fault, just one, that's enough. So the beginning is Shakespearean and the psychological reading is quite clear. But look at what follows. Because on the same screen, after the quote from Hamlet, we have a statement, again in voiceover, spoken by Laurence Olivier. This is the tragedy of a man who could not make up his mind. And this is obviously not Shakespeare, but it goes to the core of the story, to the core of a tragedy. A man who could not make up his mind. Now, legend has it that uh, there was something told by another great actor, Gary Cooper, an American actor, who once saw someone, one of the men who were working at the film Cooper was shooting, reading Hamlet. And another man asked the man, it was a stagehand, in fact, what are you reading? Hamlet, what is that? And the man replied, it's a tragedy of a man who could not make up his mind. Which of course is something which is perfect for the film. Hamlet for the millions. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to produce Hamlet for the millions because that's a situation in which every man and woman can identify. And of course, that's a situation why one of the reasons why Hamlet is still so popular. Why we can relate to Hamlet even today. We needn't be a king or a queen or anyone special to sympathize and to feel with that. How many times we are not able to make up our mind. And that's why the Washington Post, the American newspaper, defined it a movie for everybody. Be you 9 or 90, a PhD, or just plain Joe, whoever you are, you will enjoy it. Why? Because on the one hand, we have the quotation from Shakespeare, very philosophical one, and we had the Shakespearean, the Freudian reading. But on the other hand, we have the story of a man who could not make up his mind. On the other side of the Atlantic, the leading article in the Times was a bit harsher on that. The title was "Alas, Poor Hamlet," ironically quoting Hamlet himself in the play, in the graveyard scene, "Alas, poor Yorick." But Laurence Olivier later on stated that he had directed an essay in Hamlet and not a film version of a necessarily abridged classic. In other words, that was his essay in Hamlet, his own reading of Hamlet, but it was a filmic reading, not a theatrical one. And as we know, the film was a great success, both in Britain, in the USA, then all over the world. And it won in 1949. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture. The first time that happened for a Shakespeare film, and an unprecedented honor. And with that, Hollywood signed a pact with the theater. Why? Because with this film, the theater is taken over by the cinema. Taken over does not mean that the theater has been destroyed. Quite the contrary, it's been rendered in filmic ways. Now, that could be done only by someone like Laurence Olivier. Why? Because he was the icon, he was a mythical figure in the theater, but he was also a Hollywood star by the time he directed Hamlet. Here we see him in the 1939 film Wuthering Heights with Merle Oberon, one of the greatest films made. Here we see in Pride and Prejudice, another great work of literature. But we also see him in one of the most famous thriller by the master of thrillers, Alfred Hitchcock, Rebecca, 1940, which means that Laurence Olivier had the best of both worlds, as the English say. He was a Hollywood star who was also a great theatrical figure, and he put the two things together perfectly well in Hamlet, 1948. Now, the next case study I'd like to see with you is perhaps more famous, maybe among our students too, especially maybe after Spielberg's remake of a couple of years ago, West Side Story, 1961. That has to do with literature, music, and society. Why society? Because as we know, West Side Story takes the story of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, and moves it from Verona to the west side of New York. And the story takes place, the love story, the contrasted love story, takes place among juvenile gangs. So it's a story. In the end, it's a great plea for tolerance, as Leonard Bernstein says and writes in his book. Leonard Bernstein wrote the music for that, as we know and as we're going to see. Literature, music, society, integration, acceptance, these are all in West Side Story, which originally, when the project was first conceived by these men, Leonard Bernstein, music, Stephen Sondheim, lyrics, Arthur Lawrence, book, that is the theatrical story, and concept and choreography or ballets, dancing, Jerome Robbins. When these men first thought of that, that was way back in 1947, 46, so a long time, some 10 years before the musical actually came into being, because that was first a musical, West Side Story, 1957, and then it became a film in 1961. But the initial idea was to set the story in New York, in the East Side. There was to be a story of a contrasted love story between two groups, ethnical groups, or religious groups for that matter, Jews and Catholics. But then Bernstein, Sondheim, Lawrence, and Robbins dropped the idea. Why? Because there were too many such stories at that time, after the end of World War II, after the Holocaust. So that which was originally called East Side Story was taken up again in 1955, and it was called this time West Side Story. And the idea was that Bernstein and Robbins had the idea of setting it in the war of juvenile gangs, because the social problem of juvenile gangs was very strong at that time, was a very hot issue. So they decided to deal with that issue and to move the words of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, to that context. Look at the trailer. The trailer, not the one we're seeing, but one of the original ones, promoted that as the greatest love story ever told. Notice, no mention of Romeo and Juliet, not at all. Why? Because the greatest love story ever told was enough, quite enough. Here we see Leonard Bernstein composing in 1955, and doesn't it look remarkably like Bradley Cooper in the recent film Maestro? Obviously, it's no coincidence. And he changed the history of music. There's a lot to do with that. The extraordinary thing for us was that when we went to see the structure of West Side Story, we found something quite amazing, because we started from this. Well, West Side Story is no Romeo and Juliet. It's got a different title. It's not set in Venice, in Verona. It's a modern story. It's not set in the Renaissance. There's not a single word by Shakespeare. So how can it be called a Shakespearean film? But when we went into the structure of the story, the narration, the results were amazing, because put West Side Story and Romeo and Juliet side by side, and the result is quite surprising. From the very beginning, we have a prologue in New York, just as we have a prologue in Fair Verona. There's a brawl between the rival gangs in West Side Story, as there is a brawl or a fight between Capulets and Montague. The police comes in, the prince comes in. Tony, who's the lover here, is not present at the fight, just as Rome is not present at the fight. Tony is alone and melancholy, just as Romeo is alone and melancholy. Maria, which is Juliet in the film, is told before the ball, is told that her family would like to marry her to Zeno. Juliet, before the ball, is told that the family would like to give her in marriage to Count Paris, and so on and so on. We have Tony and Maria meeting at the ball, which is a modern dance, obviously, very modern, very hectic, but the essential are the same as in Romeo and Juliet. They look at each other, their hands touch, and they kiss, and they repeat their names. And when the ball is over, when the feast is over, Tony doesn't follow his friend, just as Romeo doesn't follow his friend. Why? Because Romeo wants to go to Juliet's house, just as Tony wants to go to Maria's house. And that follows the famous balcony scene, which of course does not take place in a balcony in the strict sense of the word, nothing to do with the Romeo and Juliet 1936 MGM film, but on the staircase, typical staircase of a New York tenement house with the two lovers there. And after that, the story goes on, and every single narrative structure, narrative piece of the puzzle is mirrored on Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. In the fight, for instance, between the two gangs, the two rival gangs, Tony comes in and tries to make peace, just as Romeo comes in and tries to make peace. But Romeo is the involuntary cause of Mercutio's death. The same happens in West Side Story. Now, it was quite amazing, quite rewarding to give this as an exercise to the students, because they were perfectly able, of course we didn't give them that, they had to do that by themselves, but they were able to follow that side by side and to reconstruct, if not all of it, at least the essential of it. And that's another interesting thing which can be done with Shakespeare at the cinema. Confrontation between what's been kept by a film or what has been left out. Sometimes what's been left out is very important, as with Laurence Olivier's version, and what is left compared with the play. And students, well, in my experience and in our experience, are perfectly able to do that. Of course, the results may vary, but all in all, it's quite rewarding as an experience. Well, another thing which can be done with Shakespeare and films is that we can also play with Shakespeare, not only ourselves, but our students too. There are countless films which have been made about Shakespeare, or scenes, single scenes in films, which are really quite amusing, quite funny. Like this one, from Stephen Martin's 1991 film, LA Story. It's a comic film, but in the film, it is said that Shakespeare is buried in Hollywood. And he says that Tim Martin says that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet Part 8, The Revenge, quite ironic, obviously, during his final years in Southern California, and revealing his tomb in Hollywood Cemetery, right behind Paramount Studios. Quite laughable, clearly, but again, is part of the appropriation of Shakespeare by Hollywood and by America. Of course, this is being outrageously done. This is being fun or funny, but it's quite typical. Another thing which works wonderfully with students, in my experience, is to show them a short bit from an action film, Last Action Hero, 1993, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, because in that film, there's one small boy student who is really taken with revenge films. He can think of nothing else. And he has a great hero, who's Arnold Schwarzenegger in that film. And when his teacher, the young boy's teacher, wants to show the class Hamlet, Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, by the way, she insists on the fact that Hamlet was the first action hero, a true action hero. But when the students, the class is shown the scene in which Hamlet does not kill King Claudius, which he could do quite easily, because he refrains for a number of reasons, psychological reasons, once more. And Hamlet is there with the sword, undecided whether to kill Claudius or not, but not killing him. The boy says in the class, to himself, do it. And then in his mind, in the boy's mind, there goes on a scene with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Hamlet, as in here, and Hamlet saying, hey, Claudius, you killed my father. And he picks Claudius up. Big mistake, throwing Claudius through a stained glass window and Claudius's body falling down a cliff. And voice over, very stately, not Laurence Olivier, but sort of, something is rotten in the state of Denmark, and Hamlet is taking out the trash. Notice the language. Then Hamlet fighting, killing guards with machine guns. And Polonius trying not to be killed. Stay thy hand, stop thy hand, fair prince. Who said I'm fair? And he shoot Polonius with an Uzi, with a big machine gun. Multiple shots of Hamlet walking through Elsinore Castle, shooting shoulder with his Uzi. And a narrator, no one is going to tell the sweet prince, again a quote from Hamlet, good night. Another quote from Hamlet. And Hamlet, Schwarzenegger, cigar in his mouth, to be or not to be. The cigar is not lit yet. Schwarzenegger takes out his lighter, not to be, lights his cigar, and castle explodes in the background. Show it to your class, and it's a sure success. There are more serious things to do with Shakespeare, obviously, but this might help from time to time. Well, thank you for your attention, and well, good evening to everyone. Thank you.
Grazie professore, veramente molto interessante e stimolante, molto bello ascoltarla. E credo che intanto le riporto i ringraziamenti e l'entusiasmo dei partecipanti che hanno seguito con attenzione. Alcuni ci chiedono, piccolo particolare tecnico, se le slide saranno disponibili. Sì, ovviamente, quando scaricherete l'attestato di partecipazione nella pagina Mondadori Education dedicata, troverete anche le slide che il professore ha appena utilizzato. Allora, ci sono alcune domande, non abbiamo tantissimo tempo, però gliele vorrei sottoporre perché alcune di queste sono veramente interessanti e stimolanti. Dunque, un attimo, vado un po' così. Allora, ecco, Guglielmo ci chiede: have film versions made an easier approach to Shakespeare, especially in younger generations?
Yes, they have. for two reasons. The first one is that it's easier nowadays to see a film than to buy books. It's less expensive in the first place. You can watch a Shakespeare film, on most TV networks for nothing. Or if your parents, they got a subscription to Netflix or Sky or whatever, you can watch it quite easily. So the film is mainstream, whereas the theater and buying books is not so mainstream. Again, which is not to say that the film is better, not at all. It's simply quite different. Films are mainstream, especially Hollywood films. And well, in my experience, yes, it facilitates the understanding of the work. But obviously, for me as a teacher, showing films had a twofold purpose. The first one was to introduce students to Shakespeare's plays. After that introduction, we had to go down to the text. So never leaving it out, not at all. The other thing was that by analyzing films, students make an exercise, which is an exercise in narration. In narration, saying a story, deconstructing it, finding out the main things in the story, the invariants, they are called technically. So it's a twofold exercise for me. It's a good introduction to Shakespeare, but it's also a good exercise in itself, which can be assigned, can be given to classes, I believe, quite easily, fairly easily. Of course, it all depends on the class one has in front of oneself.
Grazie. Penelope, there are also many very beautiful films taken from Shakespeare's works which didn't receive any Oscar, like, for example, Henry V by Kenneth Branagh. Can you comment on this?
Yeah. Well, as we know, first thing to say is that as we know, the Oscar is in itself no guarantee of greatness. It's like the Nobel Prize. How many great writers have not received Nobel Prize? Just not to leave English literature. James Joyce never got Nobel Prize. Virginia Woolf didn't get a Nobel Prize, but they're greatest writers. So there's no guarantee of greatness. That's one thing. The Oscar has to be considered in this light mainly. The Academy Award is not so much the film in itself, but is what the film has meant for the Hollywood community in that year, at that time. Because one thing which has to be borne in mind, and which I didn't know it myself, my director friend told it to me, and we put in our book that unlike other festivals like Venice or Cannes or Berlin or the Sundance Film Festival in the United States, for the Academy Award, there's no jury in the strict sense of the word. In other words, there is not a jury which is made up of, say, 7, 8, 12 people, usually important people, writers, directors themselves. There are 5,000 to 6,000 or 7,000 people were voting for the Oscars. And most of these 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people are not famous actors. They are technicians, sound technicians, light technicians, they are costume designers, so people in the business. So that's why the Oscar is important for them, but maybe not so much for us as viewers. And that also explains why not all great films, done from Shakespeare, have received the Oscar. But again, that goes for other films and for other writers too, not just for Shakespeare.
Grazie molte. Siamo arrivati alla fine di questa diretta. Credo che molte delle vostre altre piccole domande possiate trovare risposta nel libro di cui parlavamo prima. In chat vi avevo messo il link alla pagina di Einaudi, quindi buona lettura a tutti. Vi ringrazio il professore per questo pomeriggio.
Ringrazio voi.
E a tutti voi, che la partecipazione a questi webinar è stata molto numerosa sempre. Questo è l'ultimo della serie di quest'anno. A questo punto direi che ci vediamo il prossimo anno, e se il professore ci farà ancora l'onore di parlare con voi e di raccontarci della letteratura.
Non è un
Grazie a
onore,
tutti.
ma è un piacere, un grande piacere.
Piacere
Un
nostro.
saluto a tutti.
Grazie. Grazie, un
Arrivederci.
saluto. E la salutano tutti ovviamente, professore, nei commenti.
Grazie. Saluto a
Grazie
tutti.
a tutti.
Arrivederci.